Hi everyone! For chapter 26, we will discuss the different anatomy parts of our urinary system and the physiology of how our urinary system is able to maintain homeostasis for us in terms of fluid content. The main purpose of the urinary system is to remove metabolic waste produced by our body cells. This process of excretion is called micturition, or the anatomy word for urination. The urinary system is very critical for maintaining a lot of different homeostatic regulations. Some of these we have already mentioned from previous chapters. For example, it helps us to regulate blood volume and blood pressure by adjusting either the volume of water lost in urine or by secreting EPO. Remember from blood chapter, we talked about the purpose of EPO, erythropoietin, which was to stimulate production of red blood cells by your bone marrow cells, okay? And this is induced by a hormone called EPO that was secreted by your kidneys. So that's why when your kidney sees that it's not receiving enough blood, it will produce more EPO. And then it will help regulate blood volume and hence blood pressure by releasing renin. This is something new we will talk about. We mentioned it in another chapter slides, but I said back then don't worry about it. But this chapter, we're going to talk about that whole process of using renin to regulate your blood volume and blood pressure. Remember that blood pressure and blood volume always goes hand in hand, okay? All right. And then the other regulation of the urinary system is to help regulate plasma levels of your electrolytes, which is sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium ions. Remember that for calcium, we talked about two things that has to do with the kidney. For regulation of calcium, if you don't have enough blood calcium, your kidney will make calcitriol, and calcitriol will be released into your bloodstream from your kidney to stimulate your intestine to reabsorb more calcium back into your bloodstream. The other thing that the kidney will do is reduce excretion of calcium into your urine by reabsorbing a lot of the calcium back into your bloodstream instead of letting them go in your urine. And we'll talk about how these three things will be regulated when we get to that part of this chapter, okay? It also helps to stabilize blood pH, which we have slightly talked about in the last chapter for blood vessels when we were talking about, and the respiratory system too, when we were talking about how your blood can carry carbon dioxide. And how I mentioned that there's this reactions that has to do with your acid-base balance by having CO2 plus H2O is in equilibrium with your carbonic acid, which would then dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So your kidney can play a role in regulating how much hydrogen ions it is reabsorbing or how much hydrogen ions is secreting. Same thing with bicarbonate. And depending whether your body has too much hydrogen ions, which means it's too acidic, then it will release hydrogen ions. If it's too basic, then it will release bicarbonate. So it depends what your body's pH is, whether it's too high or too low, it will secrete different versions of these two, okay? The kidney also helps us to conserve nutrients and remove metabolic wastes. Remember we talked about urea, where that come from, and also uric acid. So those we learned from chapter 25 that through the urea cycle, you do make a byproduct and turn ammonia into urea, which you can get rid of through the urinary system. Lastly, assists liver in detoxifying poisons and deamination of amino acids during starvation, which has to do with production of urea. Other than excreting urea as it is through after the urea cycle, when you are in starvation mode, you do make a lot of keto acid, okay? And because of that, you will also make some ammonium ion, and your kidney actually can secrete ammonium ion directly, and we'll go detail into that in a bit. Detoxifying poison, your liver releases them, but you have to somehow get rid of the toxins. And how we get rid of the toxins sometimes is by excretion into your urine as well. So that's why those drug tests, if they want to test for somebody whether they're a drug addict, if they are using drugs in their body system, and that's why they look at their urine. They have to do a urinalysis test, because whatever you take into your body that is toxic for you, it will be excreted in your urine volume. Okay. All right. So the organs are relatively simple compared to the digestive system, okay, because there are only 4 parts of organ tissues in your urinary system. You have your kidney, which is right here. You have 2 of them. Which is the main organ that is filtering your blood and producing urine. And then you have your ureters right here. So these are these 2 tubes draining from the kidney into the bladder. So that's the ureter. And then this is your urinary bladder, of course. And then your urethra, which is the tube that actually allows urine to be excreted out of your body. Okay, so don't mistake urethra with ureter. Okay. Ureter is the one that connects your kidney to your bladder, and urethra is what allows your urine to go from your bladder into the outside environment. Okay, so let's go backwards in order of how urine travels through the urinary system. So we will start with the simple organs first, because those are if we go backwards, it's just easier in terms of function, because the most complicated function comes last, which is the kidney. The textbook goes in opposite order, but I thought it's just go ahead and get rid of the easy, simple organs first, and then we get to the complicated parts of the chapter, which is focusing on how kidney is able to regulate your salt concentrations and water concentrations. Okay, so let's start with the urethra, because we're going from most outer to most inner. Okay, so urethra is the tube that transfers urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body through micturition, as we have discussed. For males, the urethra is very long through these area right here. Okay, this. Okay, so then it is actually divided into 3 parts because it's so long. Okay, so there is your prosthetic urethra, which is right here. So that's your prosthetic urethra. We call it prosthetic urethra because it goes through the prostate gland. This is your prostate gland right here. Okay, prostate gland. And then you have your membranous urethra. It's kind of hard to see here, but let me draw it out on the side here. So here's the prostate gland. Here's the bladder. And then there's actually some membrane tissue right here before it goes into the penis. Okay, so all right, so you have the prosthetic urethra. This small portion right there, okay, is the membranous urethra. Okay, again, these anatomical parts I'm going through will be critical for your lab exercise when we get to the urinary system for lab exercise. And then the rest of the urethra that goes through the penis is called spongy urethra. We will talk about different parts or tissues that makes up the penis when we get to the reproductive system. But because it's surrounded by spongy tissues, that's why we call it spongy urethra. And then you will get to the outside hole right here where the urine exits out of the body, and that is called the external urethral orifice. Okay, which is voluntarily controlled when you go to pee. In females, the urethra is very short compared to the males, and it travels from the bladder to the vestibule of the vulva. Again, these parts of the reproductive system we'll get to when we get to reproductive system. But remember, this entire area is called the vulva. And then the vulva has 2 flaps of tissue, which is your outer lip versus your inner lip, labia majora and labia minora. And between the labia minora, you have this tissue right here that has your either your urethra or your vaginal opening. Okay, so that's the vestibule part of the vulva. Okay, so the vestibule is within that labia minora layer, and that's where also our urethra is going to end up in. Okay, so the urethra is very short. It's just right here. Okay, this is the bladder. This is the urethra. So that's why it's not divided into three parts like the males, because of how short it is. Now, because the urethra for females is a lot shorter, we are more susceptible to urinary tract infection known as UTI, okay, which then can lead to bladder infections called cystitis. So UTI oftentimes can lead to cystitis because once bacteria is cultivating inside your urethra, it will have a very easy time to just spread to the bladder part. Okay, and because for females the urethra is a lot shorter, they have a much shorter route to travel to the bladder compared to males. Now, symptoms of UTI or cystitis usually is pain with urination, increased urge to urinate, and may cause even pelvic pain and blood in the urine. Okay, so any of these symptoms, usually the pain with urination is the best symptom that something is going on with either a UTI or your bladder cystitis. Okay, so the urethra leads into the external urethral sphincter, which is made up of skeletal muscular band. Okay, so make sure you remember that is skeletal muscular band, because that's different from internal urethral sphincter, which is not made of a skeletal. If it's made up of skeletal muscles, it means it is voluntary control. Okay, so that's why it can't be smooth muscle, or else we can't voluntarily control smooth muscle. So when we need to pee, we are voluntarily telling our skeletal muscular band to relax, so that it allows urine excretion. Okay? The epithelial lining of urethra changes from your transitional epithelium. Remember from 2401, we learned that the epithelium that makes up your bladder is called transitional because it can change from somewhat of a plumpy shape into a flat shaped cells depending on the state of the bladder, whether it's full or empty. But at the neck of the urethra, closer to the bladder, is actually still transitional epithelium for urethra. And then when it gets close at the midpoint of the urethra, it changes into stratified columnar epithelium. Stratified columnar epithelium, which is not very common in any other parts of our body. And the last portion changes into stratified squamous epithelium near that external urethral orifice. Okay, so the next organ up is the urinary tract, which is after the urinary tract, is the urinary bladder. Okay, so urinary bladder is a hollow muscular organ that is for temporary storage of urine before excretion. Now, there are three parts of the urinary bladder. It has, again, what's called rugae. Remember from digestive system, in the stomach, we have rugae that allows for expansion of the stomach. So for bladder, it works the same way. There are folds within the bladder organ that allows for expansion of the bladder when it is filled with urine. So these folds in here are the rugae. Okay, so that's why there's rugae. And then you have trigon. Okay, trigon is actually the smooth area right here. Okay, within this area is triangular shape. That's why it's called trigon. It is that smooth area that is bound by openings of the ureters, okay, which is called uretic orifices. I'll get to that when we talk about ureters. But where they enter from the ureters, that's what marks the two boundary of the trigon. Okay, so you have your internal urethral sphincter and then the two uretic orifices. Those 3 points is what forms this triangular funnel shape at the bottom of the bladder called trigon that allows for urine to drain into the urethra. Okay, so that's why it's in that smooth muscle that allows for urine to drain. That's why it's in that triangular shape in like a funnel. Internal urethral sphincter. Now, this is what I was talking about. Is not skeletal muscles that make up your internal urethral sphincter, which is within that area right there. Okay, so the smooth muscle fibers within the internal urethral sphincter is what provides that involuntary control of draining your urine from your bladder into your urethra. Okay, we don't have to control, hey bladder, let's release those urine. You're not controlling that internal sphincter. You're only controlling the external urethral sphincter. Okay. So within the bladder, there is that same 3 layers we talked about in the digestive system. Okay, we have the mucosa layer, which is transitional epithelium, as we have learned from 2401. So this right here is the mucosa layer. Okay, all this area along the bladder. This is a zoom out view of the bladder here. And then if we zoom in to this area just on the mucosa layer, you have transitional epithelium, because when it is an empty bladder, the cells looks a little bit more plumpy like. Okay, those from my previous semester class probably remember how I described these as little plumpy cells, because your bladder is not push or have pressure exerted on it due to presence of urine, whereas your distended bladder, which is a full bladder, you have lots of urine here, which then will push, have some kind of a fluid pressure force exerted on the epithelium right here, and flatten those cells from plumpy shape into flat little shapes. Okay, so that's why it's called transitional epithelium. And then the submucosa layer is right here underneath the mucosa layer. The muscular layer is all this right here within the bladder. It's actually called detrusor muscle. Okay, so remember detrusor muscles for muscles of the bladder. And when you're ready to pee, the bladder actually will contract, which causes these detrusor muscles to contract, that will compress the bladder and allow urine to be expelled from your bladder into the urethra. Okay, and then of course you voluntarily will release urine from the external urethral sphincter. Okay, all right. The next part of the urinary tract upwards are the ureters. Okay, so these are a pair of muscular tubes from the kidney. So here are your kidneys. So here's that ureter I was talking about that drains into the bladder. Okay, it goes from what's called the renal pelvis right there. I'll go through those parts in a bit, but it drains from the renal pelvis into the bladder. Okay, it penetrates the bladder at the uretic orifices. Okay, these holes right here. So this actually is going in the back of the bladder, reaching this hole. Same thing with this ureter right here is actually in back of the bladder, and then punctures into the bladder through these orifices. Now, what's special about these orifices is they have slits that prevent them from having backflow of urine, even when your bladder contracts or when your bladder is very full. Okay, if you have sort of regurgitation of urine going up your ureter, that's a problem. Okay, it's actually going to cause a lot of pressure to be backed up into your kidney, which can lead to kidney failure. We'll talk about that when we talk about kidney function. So these are actually little slits within the bladder that allows for inflow of urine from the kidney ureter into the bladder. And once it's in the bladder, it can't backtrack and go back up due to the presence of these uretic orifices slits. Okay, uteric orifices. Okay, now by the time urine has reached this area, no more filtration or urine production is happening any longer. This is coming right out of the kidney, and it is the kidneys that does all that filtration process and produce urine. The ureter, bladder, urethra are all just hollow organs that allow for transportation and storage of urine. So that's why here it says filtrate modification, urine production end once urine enters from your kidney into your urinary tract. So that's why all these organs right here is considered as your urinary tract. Okay. Now for ureters, there are the 3-layer walls again. You have your inner mucosa layer, which is this layer right here, and it's also transitional epithelium, just like your bladder. And then the middle muscular layer, which is this layer right here, okay? This layer, okay? That layer is the smooth muscle layer, okay, which it has also, just like your esophagus, remember we talked about that, it has longitudinal and circular bands of the smooth muscle that will allow for peristalsis of the urine. And then you have outer connective tissue layer around right there. Okay, which is continuous with what's called the fibrous capsule. The fibrous capsule is what surrounds that kidney and holds the kidney in place. Okay, has a little capsule around it, and that is continuous with the ureters. Okay, and it also is continuous with the peritoneum as well. Remember, peritoneum is the serous membrane of your abdominal cavity. All right. Again, like I said, just like the digestive system, urine will be pushed and moved through these long ureters by peristalsis. That's why you have those same longitudinal and circular bands of smooth muscle in the muscular layer within the ureters, just like intestines or esophagus. Instead of moving chyme or bolus, okay, we are moving urine in this case. It actually contracts every 30 seconds to move your urine towards the bladder, something that you can't control. It just happens on its own. Thankfully, we have enough things that we need to control of. Okay. And finally, you have the most complicated organ of the urinary system, which is the kidney. We have 2 of these organs that are located retroperitoneally. Remember, retroperitoneal means it's half attached by serous membrane, just like the esophagus, not entirely surrounded by the serous membrane. Okay, so it is located, again, retroperitoneally in the superior lumbar region with respect to the spine, and they have functional units called nephrons. Sounds like neurons, but don't confuse them. Nephrons are those tubes within the kidneys that are very important for secretion and reabsorption of fluids and electrolytes for us. And those little tubes we'll talk immensely about, but we have gazillions of them inside our kidney. So if this is our kidney, okay, there are tiny little nephrons all around the kidney portion, and we'll talk about that in a bit, okay? All right, so there are 3 layers of connective tissue that protects and stabilize our kidneys. You have your fibrous capsule, which was what I was trying to talk about in the ureter section. It is the layer of collagen fibers that cover the outer surface of the kidney is actually the most inner layer of those connective tissues. Not the most inner layer of the kidney, but most inner layer of those protective tissues that protect your organ, okay? And then you have your perinephric fat, which is the middle layer. You see here you have this fibrous capsule surrounding the kidney, and those yellow tissues are then your perinephric fat that protects and insulates your kidney organ. And then you have your renal fascia, which is this right here. Okay, that's your renal fascia. Those are actually dense fibrous layer for anchoring your kidney and make sure that your kidney stays in place where it's supposed to be, okay? And then it is actually sort of hanging with these collagen fibers so your kidney stays in these area instead of dropping down into your pelvic area, okay? And there is diseases associated with that, okay? I'll talk about, here it is. So when something happens to any of these things that's supposed to anchor, especially your renal fascia, that can supposed to anchor your kidney, but if it becomes detached for whatever reason, we call this condition the floating kidney. So if kidney becomes detached, any external shock, okay, so any external shock, meaning bending or someone accidentally hitting your back of your abdomen from the back or your abdomen from the front, can actually move your kidney, which then can put pressure on your blood vessels and ureters that come out of your kidney, because your kidney is supposed to be nicely suspended right here, and then you have your blood vessels that's coming out of it and your ureters that's coming out of it, and it's hanging like this and drains into your bladder. But if you have a floating kidney like this that's been dropped to your pelvic area, so all of those then ends up being something like this, where it is squished by your pelvic area, and any movement can actually collapse these tubes, and it can actually block either blood flow or block your urine from passing, and this can be serious, okay? So these are the two x-ray images that shows where's that kidney and what happens when a person has floating kidney. You can see that you can either bend your ureters like this, if pressure is exerted, you can actually stop urine flow. Now, blockage of ureters then can become very detrimental to kidney, because that can result in urine backup into the kidney. The whole filtration process will stop within the kidney, and toxins will then start building up in the person's blood. So it is very critical that our ureters is not blocked. And this a lot of times happen with cancer patients if the tumor has traveled to this area. So other than floating kidney that can cause ureter blockage, cancer a lot of times also can cause ureter blockage, okay? Somehow tumors can travel to this area of the body and start growing a mass of tissue around the ureter, okay? And this can cause urine blockage. And if not fixed by putting some sort of temporary tube that can drain the kidney directly to an external drainage bag or something, it can lead to kidney failure. Toxins will build up in the bloodstream, and the patient dies within a few days, okay, or a week even. And unfortunately, this was how my mom died from her cancer, so that's why I know more about that, okay? So she didn't want to put a bag where you can actually have a tube thing that can excrete into the outside of the body and have the bag carry around you. But she didn't want that process because it was her second time having cancer reoccurring in herself. So she just want to end it that way. All right. So, okay, on to the basic anatomy parts of the kidney. You have the hilum. Now, remember where we talked about the hilum. Remember with lymphatic nodes, okay, which is lymph nodes. With lymph nodes, I said you have the hilum in there. And hilum a lot of times means some sort of indentation that will allow for entry of arteries, veins, or even nerves. Okay, and in this case, we have hilum of the kidney that also allows for the ureter. So this indentation area right here is the hilum of the kidney, okay, that will allow for those different blood vessels or ureter to go through. So that's why we have hilum right there. Now, just like any organ in our body, there is a specific direction of blood flow, okay, in and out of the kidneys, and we'll talk about that in a bit, okay? Now, let's finish up with different anatomical parts of the kidney. You have the renal cortex. Renal cortex, remember when we talked about adrenal gland, cortex is the outer area of the organ. So this whole area right here is the renal cortex, just like how we had the adrenal cortex. This is the renal cortex, which is in contact with that fibrous capsule we were talking about that protects your kidney organ. The renal medulla, then it is this layer right here, the inner layer of the kidney. This whole area is the renal medulla, which consists of usually 6 to 18 of these what's called renal pyramids. Each one of these are a renal pyramid. Okay, that's why they're triangular structure. That's why we call them pyramid, because they have these triangular shapes. And then they would converge at what's called the renal papilla. Okay, so renal papilla right here. So this whole thing is a renal pyramid, and it drains into the renal papilla, and then the lighter pink parts in between each of these renal pyramid is renal column. Okay, because they are columns between the pyramids. Okay, there are bands of your renal cortex tissue. So that's why it's cortical tissues, because it's the same tissue that makes up your renal cortex and separates those pyramid from each other. And then you have a kidney lobe like this. So one of these is called a kidney lobe, and it consists of one renal pyramid, and then you have your adjacent tissues of renal cortex and column. So here's your renal cortex area, and then you have part of the renal column on this side and part of the renal column on the other side. So this is what we call one kidney lobe. Okay, and these purple things you're seeing right here are those nephrons we're talking about as a basic unit, functional unit of the kidney. Now, the papilla ducts will discharge urine from the pyramid, so because that's your nephron, and then it will discharge urine into this renal papilla area, which then drains into this tiny little cup area called the minor calyx. So this cup little thing is kind of like a cup that sits underneath your renal pyramid area to collect any fluid that comes downwards. Okay, and then minor calyx actually then drains into major calyx. Okay, so this area right here is the major calyx. Let me do some erasing so we can be clear of what we're talking about. Okay, so you have these are your minor calyx. This area is a major calyx. Okay, major calyx, minor calyx. So urine flows from your renal pyramid into your renal papilla, and then drains in your minor calyx and drains into your major calyx, which then drains into this entire funnel-shaped area called the renal pelvis. Okay, and from the renal pelvis is where then your urine will drain into the ureter. So this whole area is the renal pelvis. Okay, and then continue draining the urine downwards into your ureters. Okay, so are we good with the anatomy parts? Okay, so you have to identify these on the lab exercise. Okay, all right, so for blood vessels, like I said, we will talk about how your blood circulation happens within the kidney, and then comes right back out. So remember, blood will go from the abdominal aorta because you have your heart. Okay, and then it comes out of the aorta, and aorta goes straight down into the body, down to the bottom part, which is your abdominal aorta. And from the abdominal aorta, remember when we labeled these in lab exercise, there was that abdominal aorta, and then it branches out into your renal artery and renal vein. So this is where the abdominal aorta would be, and here's your renal artery. Okay, and from renal artery, the blood circulation then goes to what's called these here, called the segmental artery. A few of these segmental arteries. Actually, there's 5 of them if you want to count them. And then they will further divide into your interlobular arteries. Okay, between lobular, between those lobes. Okay, so that's why these, remember, one lobule of the kidney is right here, one lobule, and then so interlobular arteries are those on the 2 sides of the lobe, and then you have to go to your arcuate artery. Arcuate artery is right here. Okay, arcuate artery, which is the horizontal one. So this one is the interlobular artery. This one here, more horizontal on the top of the pyramid, is called the arcuate artery. And then It forms a boundary between your cortex and your medulla area, okay? And then you have these smaller ones called the cortical radiate artery. So all of these lines you're seeing all along the cortex, renal cortex area, those are your cortical radiate artery, okay? And then they will get into your afferent arteriole. I'll talk more about these when we get to the glomerulus, but you'll see what I mean. From our afferent arteriole, then it goes to the glomerulus of the nephron, and from the glomerulus, it comes back out the other side in efferent arteriole. Remember what I said about afferent and efferent. Afferent is for arrival of the blood. Efferent is for exit of the blood. And from efferent arteriole, the blood is going to circulate around the peritubular capillaries, which are capillaries that surrounds your nephron. So we'll talk about this in a bit, but you know the nephron kind of looks like this, and there's actually capillaries that surround the entire nephron. Those are your peritubular capillaries, which then drains back into your venules, into your cortical radiate veins. That's why you see both red and blue all along the renal cortex area. I'm trying to get the laser. There you go. So you have the renal cortex area. You see all these blue things. Those are a cortical radiate vein, which drains into your arcuate vein, and then which drains into your interlobular vein, and then back through your renal vein, and then back up the inferior vena cava to back to your heart. So that's the whole entire circulation of your kidney. Okay, so this will become very critical, especially this is because that's how we can reabsorb things we need back into our blood and filter out stuff we don't want out of our blood. Okay, all right. So there are renal nerves that also enter at the hilum to innervate your kidneys and ureters for sympathetic stimulation that will either adjust the rate of your urine formation by changing blood flow at the nephron or influence urine composition. What your urine is there more is there more water content in your urine, or are we in water conservation mode and hence we're not releasing as much water into your urine? We'll talk about the details of these two processes later in the lecture, okay? Now remember the nephron are functional units within the kidney that allows for filtration process. It is divided into three main parts. You have your renal corpuscle, renal tubule, and your collecting system. Okay, so this right here is your renal corpuscle. This right here is your renal tubule, and this right here is your collecting system. Okay, these three different parts all have different functions, and we'll talk about them in detail in a bit. Okay. Now, let's talk about just the anatomical parts first. So the renal corpuscle, okay, contains what's called the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule, which is this thing right here. So this whole thing is called the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule, acting as the outer layer that is made up of simple squamous epithelium, okay? Simple squamous epithelium. So this is made up of simple squamous, okay, epithelium. And you'll have to see, we'll have to label this Bowman's capsule when we get to that lab exercise, okay? Within here, this is what we refer to as the glomerulus, okay? Glomerulus, which is made up of fenestrated capillaries, okay? The visceral layer, okay, so we have the visceral layer versus that capsular outer layer. Like I said, the capsular outer layer is made up of the simple squamous epithelium. The visceral layer right here are actually covered up because you can see that this is a capillary right here, but then you start to see these weird purple things all wrapping around it. Those purple things are actually cells, and the visceral layer is made up of these cells called the podocytes, okay? Podocytes right here, podocytes, okay? So those podocytes will then wrap around the blood vessel and goes into the glomerulus, okay? That goes into the glomerulus, and that's what allows for filtration of solutes in your blood, okay? So then the other two things I want to mention is your afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole. Remember I said this is part of that circulation within your glomerulus area. So afferent, remember A for arrival. So the arrival actually comes from here, okay? Blood arrives to your kidney through the afferent arteriole. Then blood goes into the glomerulus, go through all these capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, and then comes right back out in the efferent arteriole. Okay, so blood arrives from the afferent arteriole, goes into the glomerulus to be filtered, and then goes out your efferent, exits out of your efferent arteriole. Okay? All right. Okay, so the capsular outer layer and the visceral layer is what's called the capsular space right here. So this space between the glomerulus, okay, and the outer capsular layer, this space right here is called the capsular space. And we can actually see the capsular space in histology view or microscopic view of the kidney, okay? The main function of the glomerulus is filtration. Okay, we'll talk about three processes: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion that's made possible by your kidney. So it is this renal corpuscle area is where we're able to do filtration. This is made possible by what's called the filtration membrane. It is made up of fenestrated epithelium of the capillary. Remember, we talked about what fenestrated epithelium means. There's little pores in it that will allow for filtration. And then there's also a basement membrane that connects your capillary wall to your foot processes of the podocytes. Remember I said these podocytes are like cells wrapping around the capillaries. So that's the three things that make up your filtration membrane. It is this membrane that allows water and small solutes to pass into the capsular space right there for further secretion and reabsorption process. So blood again enters afferent, arterial, all those small little things, and water will then come into the capsular space, which then will travel onto your renal tubule area for further secretion and reabsorption. Okay. While it blocks big things from your blood like red blood cells and plasma proteins from entering your urine, that's why, but it allows small stuff to come through. So that's why you shouldn't see proteins and blood in your urine. But if you see blood or albumin, which is a form of protein that appears in your urine, something is wrong because your filtration membrane within your glomerulus is supposed to block those big things into your urine. But if you see these big things in the urine, something is probably wrong with the filtration membrane. Something is torn somewhere that is allowing big things to pass through. Okay? All right. So the second portion of the nephron is your renal tubule after your glomerulus. It is further divided into three parts. You have your proximal convoluted tubule, which is this portion right here. So this is what's called your PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. And then you have your distal convoluted tubule, which is known as the DCT. And then you have your loop of Henle right here. Okay, so that's loop of Henle. Okay, is usually in that U-shape area. These two are called convoluted because they are convoluted. They're bending and folding into little curvatures. Okay, so that's why they are called convoluted, and this is called a loop because it's in just this nice U-shaped organ. Okay. The main functions of these tubules are reabsorption of critical things like water and salts and ions that we need back in our blood, and secretion of extraneous things or toxic things into the urine. So for example, if you ingested too much vitamin C that your body doesn't need, your urine will look like a slightly greenish color. It's because all that stuff that is in your nephron is not needed because there's enough in your body. So it just goes in, stays in your urine, and then hence then it will be drained into your collecting duct, which drains into your bladder. Okay, so whatever our body has too much of and we don't need is usually excreted through our urine. All right. So the type of epithelium that makes up these three parts of the renal tubule also differs. The epithelium of the PCT is simple cuboidal epithelium, okay, but it has lots of these microvilli for reabsorption. Most of the reabsorption of critical ions happens within the PCT of the nephron. So that's why they have a lot of those microtubules for a lot of reabsorption, okay? The loop of Henle has divided into three parts as well. You have the descending thin limb, which is right here, okay? Descending thin limb, okay? Descending thin limb is made up of squamous epithelium, simple squamous. And then you have the thin ascending thin limb, which is right here, okay? This section is the ascending thin limb, which is also made up of simple squamous epithelium. And then you have this section of the loop of Henle right here called the thick ascending limb, okay? So, but rather than memorizing these three parts of the loop of Henle by abbreviation, I always find it easier to just remember descending versus ascending, thin versus thick, okay? And I won't ding you on the exam lab practical, if you give me thick ascending limb and thin ascending limb, I won't ding you for that. But if you give me the wrong abbreviation in the wrong order, then I'm going to have to ding you for that because they are the same abbreviation. So make sure you remember these three parts of the loop of Henle by its long name. It's easiest that way. If it's because urine always goes downwards from the PCT into the loop of Henle through the descending thin limb, and then it'll come up through the ascending thin limb and then the ascending thick limb, and then goes back into the DCT. Okay? Now, when you get to the thick ascending limb, it's actually made up of cuboidal cells again. Okay? Because this is where, again, a lot of reabsorption of salts would happen. I'll talk about all that different ion and water reabsorption because the loop of Henle has a very special way of the way that they're made up that only allows for reabsorption of salts on this side and allows for water reabsorption on this side. Okay. Now, the DCT's epithelium is made up of simple cuboidal epithelial cells as well, but they have no or few microvilli because their main job is just reabsorption of some water and selected ions, and they conduct active secretion of waste and toxins. So it's not a lot of reabsorption. They still do some, but not a lot. So that's why you don't have as much of microvilli in this area in the DCT versus the PCT. So you can see how different areas of the nephron has different types of epithelial cells for their particular function. So make sure you know the different types of epithelial cells and make up each different section of the nephron, okay, and different sections of the loop of Henle as well. Okay, so the DC, let's see, we already talked about DCT. Okay, so the last part of the nephron is the collecting system. This is where urine from each nephron drains into the collecting duct. Okay, the collecting duct right here, okay, it begins in the cortex area and descends into the medulla. Remember, there is that cortex area, and then you have starting point of the the renal pyramids and drains into the renal papilla, which is where papillary duct begins, and then you drains into your minor calyx area, which is that little cup. So remember that whole lobule thing is what we're looking at here. Now with the collecting duct, it has cuboidal cells, okay, and they are actually differentiated into two main types of cells. The papillary duct actually have columnar cells, okay. So within the collecting duct, there are two types of cells called intercalated cells versus principal cells. They're slightly different from each other. The intercalated cells are cuboidal cells with microvilli, just like how PCT versus DCT. PCT has a lot of microvilli, DCT doesn't have that many. Intercalated cells has microvilli. Principal cells don't have that much microvilli, okay? Because intercalated cells is for regulation of acid-base balance in the blood. They will either secrete hydrogen ions or reabsorb bicarbonate, or they will secrete bicarbonate and reabsorb H+. Now, which is which? When you're secreting hydrogen ions, that means pH is too low or acidic. Okay, so that's why your kidney will secrete those hydrogen ions out and reabsorb more of this bicarbonate ions to buffer that acidic environment. When your blood pH is too high, okay, pH too high or too basic, this is when you will secrete bicarbonate ions and reabsorb hydrogen ions, okay? Now, principal cells is just for reabsorption of water and secretion of potassium ions. We'll talk about that when we get to the actual functions of the nephrons. Now, with nephrons, there are actually two main types in the kidneys. One is called the cortical nephrons. The other is called juxtamedullary nephron. Almost 85% of all nephrons is actually this type of cortical nephron, so they're more numerous. They have short loop of Henle like this, and they're mostly within the renal cortex region. That's why we call them cortical nephrons, because they're mostly in the cortex region. After filtration in the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole coming out of the glomerulus would drain into the network of capillaries called the peritubular capillaries. See how all these red lines are sort of wrapping all around the loop of Henle, DCT, PCT. Because all that secretion, reabsorption, and all that stuff back into your blood, somehow those urine passing through the renal tubules need to get back to your blood somehow, okay? And how they get back to your blood is by using these peritubular capillaries, kind of like how there's capillaries between your alveoli and your capillary wall. Okay, so those are for diffusion of gases back in the lungs. Now we're talking about diffusion of ions and fluids from your renal tubule to your capillaries that surround the renal tubules, called the peritubular capillaries. So these are what's going to bring your blood back to your venules, followed by cortical radiate veins, and then we'll all that stuff we talked about in the sequence of blood flow already. Okay. The other type of nephron is called the juxtamedullary nephrons, which makes up 15% of all nephrons. They have very long loop of Henle, okay, so that's why you see this long loop of Henle descending into the renal medulla region. And their efferent arterioles will drain blood into your peritubular capillaries around your PCT and DCT. And then there's a different type of capillary called the vasa recta. Vasa recta only exists with juxtamedullary nephron. There is no vasa recta with cortical nephron. Vasa recta only wraps around the loop of Henle of juxtamedullary nephron, okay? So these vasa recta capillaries are long and straight down here. That is for allowing diffusion of water and ions next to your loop of Henle for juxtamedullary nephron. You will need to identify these in the models within lab exercise for the urinary system, as with all the other parts I've been talking about. So what type of metabolic wastes are generated by the body that needs to be excreted into the urine? Okay, we have your urea, which is most abundant, is from breakdown of amino acids. If you remember, the urea cycle is turning ammonium ions into urea. The kidney also expels your ammonium ions on its own as well. You have creatine. Creatine is actually generated. Remember, we talked about this in 2401 in your muscles, where you can use creatine kinase to make very fast ATP that will supply your muscles with energy, okay? But there is a byproduct called creatinine that you have to break, sort of get rid of through your urinary system. Uric acid is actually a form of waste that's generated from recycling of nitrogenous bases from either your DNA or RNA, because you do eat food that has these nucleic acids in there, and we can actually recycle some of those nitrogenous bases, but there is a byproduct that's made from breakdown nucleic acids called uric acid that needs to be secreted from your urine. The other functional or critical function of kidneys is that they concentrate our blood, filtrate in urine so that we can minimize water loss. That's a very important function of the kidneys, or else we won't be able to have enough water to supply our body. How much water is reabsorbed back into the body is highly regulated by hormones that control your kidneys. And when we're talking about water reabsorption, we're also talking about blood volume and hence blood pressure. So that's why the kidney is so critical, such a critical organ for a body's function, such that if they fail, a person can die within days because of how important it is. Now, there are 3 basic processes of the urine function that we will talk about in detail in the next part of the lecture, okay? So let me finish these 3 steps and then we'll take a break, okay? So 3 basic processes of urine formation is filtration, which is where your normal blood pressure is forcing water and solutes through that filtration membrane in your glomerulus. So filtration happens within the glomerulus and then pushes liquid into the capsular space, which then drains in your renal tubule, okay? The second part is called reabsorption, which is where removing water and solids from your filtrates back into your peritubular fluid, which then can travel back into your peritubular capillaries, back into your cardiovascular system for reabsorption of those essential things. Okay, they either go by osmosis or simple diffusion or carrier proteins we'll talk about. Secretion is when we're trying to transport solids from your blood and peritubular fluid into your tubular fluid, which means your urine, okay? So don't mistake peritubular with tubular, okay? Tubular means what's inside the renal tubes, which is urine. Peritubular means outside of the tubes, which is interstitial fluid, okay? Interstitial fluid, okay? So don't mistake these two in terms of which fluid are we talking about. Where are these fluids are we talking about? Now, most parts of the nephron will conduct a combination of reabsorption and secretion. They're mostly carried out by your cortical nephrons because you have a lot more of them in your kidney, okay? So let's take let's finish this part and we'll take a break. Juxtamedullary nephrons, okay, are the ones that play a key role in water conservation because they have that long loop of Henle that descends into your renal medulla region, and that's what helps in forming concentrated urine. And then because most of the water reabsorption actually happens within the loop of Henle along with your PCT. We'll talk about this in detail in the next part. Hence, our kidney is super critical to our body's function in maintaining homeostasis, and it only functions within a very narrow limits that we shall discuss different parts of these limits throughout this chapter and the next chapter on fluid and electrolytes. So that's why I say this chapter and next chapter for fluid electrolytes are the last complicated chapter for this semester, okay? All right, so let's take a break and we will come back to this in part 2 of chapter 26, okay?